Welcome to the final session today, and guess what? I'm not David Concannon either. David was in the hall, but he's in the middle of a very difficult case at the moment, and so he's asked me to play the video that he's already recorded, and then he'll join us for questions. And the video is about 38 minutes, so he will be available about 22 the next hour. Now, David is an attorney with more than 40 years of experience as a scuba diver and 30 years as a trial lawyer in courtrooms around the US. Through his law firm, Concannon and Charles, David represents a myriad of clients in the diving industry and is an expert on the legal issues associated with scuba diving. Now, his talk is called "What Can Happen Legally After an Incident?" and it looks about the processes that are there. So it's this the processes and procedures for investigating a scuba fatality or serious injury. So Tim, if you can roll the video, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is David Concannon, and I'm here to talk to you about accident investigations. Generally speaking, every time there's a scuba serious accident or fatality, you'll have an accident investigation. Depending on where you are, what jurisdiction you're in, and who is involved, the accident investigation may either take place privately with an insurance company or an attorney, or families for the person involved in the accident. They take place through law enforcement, which would be sheriff and or local state Marine police if you're in the United States. Most of what I'm talking about is in the United States. And if there's a fatality, generally speaking, you'll have an investigation with the state or county coroner or medical examiner. So let's go through some of these things. I'm going to start my slide presentation, share screen, and just give you some of the things that happen during an accident investigation. Hold on just a second here. Play from start. All right, what happens after a diving accident? The process and procedures for investigating a scuba fatality or serious injury. Just for background, I represent, most of you will know who I am, about half of the diving industry that does business in the United States, half the training agencies, 2 of the 3 insurance companies. I'm lead defense counsel for them. I'm general counsel of the Rebreather Education Safety Association, and on and on and on. I represent a lot of manufacturers. So I'm involved in a lot of accident investigations. In the past year, I've been involved in 22. 16 last year, even during COVID. 6 so far this year in 2021. On average, I do between 12 and 15 fatality or serious accident investigations every year. Very few of those turn into lawsuits, but I still get involved pretty much the day after an incident or a couple days after an incident to find out what happened. And when I say find out what happened, I don't mean find out who's responsible. It's just a matter of what happened and what caused this person's injuries and what caused them to die. And the answers are important because in the United States, manufacturers of equipment have 24 hours to notify the Consumer Product Safety Commission if there's been a serious injury or accident that's related to their product. So there's a law that actually requires the manufacturers to do an investigation, irregardless of whether the police or the medical examiner or the coroner are doing an investigation. So that's why I'm often involved on behalf of the manufacturers. We have a legal duty to do so. We'll run a parallel investigation to the authorities. We'll cooperate with them. If they want the cooperation, we always offer it. They don't often want it, but it's always better if they have it. So that's why I know a little bit about this topic. Actually, I know a lot about this topic, a lot more than I ever wanted to know or want to continue to know. An accident is often the product of unlikely coincidences or errors occurring at an inopportune time when there is no system flexibility. In other words, that's from Chris Acott, founder of the Diving Incident Monitoring Study in Australia, and Chris and his group do an excellent job and have done an excellent job for at least 2 decades now on monitoring scuba accidents and serious incidents and trying to determine the causes, trying to determine the links in the causal chain that make an accident happen and lead to an unfortunate outcome. Sometimes it's a fortunate outcome, but If you can go back down the causal chain, and I'll explain that in a moment, to the triggers that start that chain of events from occurring, you can either predict what they are, plan for them, train for them, manufacture more safe products to accommodate those triggers, and generally make scuba diving a more safe sport, which is the objective of all the reputable manufacturers and training agencies, and certainly the insurance companies that I know and I work for. So it's important to recognize that there's never just one cause of a scuba accident. There's never just one thing that causes a diver to die. It's often the product of a series of events, beginning oftentimes before a diver enters the water. You can trace the causal chain back sometimes weeks or years to a specific trigger that set things in motion that ended up one thing after another, after another, after another, leading to the death of a diver. Accident investigations are meant to identify the individual elements in this series of events known as the causal chain. So that's what you focus on. When did this series of events start, and everywhere down the line, what role snowballed, and what can you do to prevent future accidents? There's a principle called the Pareto principle, which is actually very, very important. It's also known as the 80-20 rule, or the law of the vital few. The Pareto principle says that for many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. That's really true and can be applicable to scuba diving. Improper training, undisclosed medical events, or lack of appreciation for medical conditions, overweighting. These are the things that get divers every time. And of the 16 investigations I did last year, 3 involved overweighting of a student. Probably half of them involved medical events that were foreseeable because the diver was already suffering from some ailment that was exacerbated by going underwater. 2 were perhaps asymptomatic COVID, which is a new one, but if it wasn't COVID in those instances, it was arterial gas embolism caused by some other feature with emergent pulmonary edema, for example. And it's often the same things. Panic, another thing. We see the same things over and over and over again, so they're pretty easy to spot. And if you do 20 investigations a year, and there's only 4 or 5 principal causes, they're pretty obvious. You don't assume that it's going to be something. You look at all the evidence, but at the end of the day, it comes back to almost always the same factors over and over and over again. So when you do a proper investigation of a scuba accident, I personally prefer to publicly disclose the information that's found. Oftentimes that's subject to privacy laws here in the United States. It's not in the Commonwealth countries where, in say England, Canada, Australia, where they have a strong history of a coroner's inquest, and they'll actually hear evidence, and they'll collect data and information, and they'll have experts come in to testify. That's a process that is really excellent and really helps to identify these vital few. In the United States, it's different because medical records are subject to privacy laws, and there's a patchwork. Every state has different laws regarding the releasing of medical records and autopsy records. It's really catch as catch can. A lot of times, if the family's willing to disclose something, we get somewhere. And for example, you'll hear from Ashley Boogie during this conference, and Ashley has been amazing in trying to educate the public about what caused the death of her husband, Brian. And she's really worth listening to, and she's been a real champion for safety. And some of you are probably sitting here watching this today because Ashley had the courage to talk about what caused her husband's death. So let's move on, and I'll give you a sense of exactly what it is that you look for in a diving accident. The causal chain I talked about always starts with a trigger or a series of triggers. Triggers are the initiating root cause. Was the diver cold? Was the diver tired? Was the diver poorly trained? Was the diver overwhelmed by the circumstances they were getting and they were nervous? Did they have equipment that they were not familiar with? Was the equipment properly configured? Was the gas filled with Was the tank filled with gas? Was the tank filled with clean gas? Was, you know, these are the triggers, the root causes that initiate the causal chain, the series of events. And the triggers, there are often more than one. They're sometimes unidentifiable. Sometimes you don't find them for years. But that's where you look, and that's where you start the investigation. The trigger leads to something called the disabling agent or the harmful event. You ran out of air, and then you rush to the surface. Rushing to the surface is the harmful event. The disabling agent is the root cause as an effect of the trigger. Because you ran out of air, you rush to the surface. The disabling injury is the cause of death or something that makes drowning unlikely. Because you ran out of air and you panicked and you rushed to the surface, you suffered from an arterial gas embolism. You didn't exhale continuously, or you held your breath, or you ascended too quickly to be able to exhale all the air in your lungs. That's the disabling injury that results from the harmful event. And that leads to the cause of death, the final outcome of the fatal chain of events, which is typically a drowning. About 80% of the time it's listed as a drowning. But what caused somebody to drown? That's the question we're asking. Why did they drown? Did they breathe in water because they lost their regulator? Did they get water in their lungs after they had suffered agonal breathing, which is the breathing that your body does when you're unconscious just before death, and that will inspire water into your lungs? Or did they tear the lungs? These are the things that we try to determine when you do an accident investigation. The cause of death is what's specified by the coroner or the medical examiner after an investigation, considering all the factors. We hope it's often not the case, but that is what you're leading to. So in the accident investigation, you go back and look for the triggers, disabling events, harmful events, and then the disabling injury. Proper SCUBA investigations are conducted using this root cause analysis, as I've said. And again, the trigger to the disabling injury, agent, harmful action, leading to the cause of death. Jurisdiction often determines the type and efficacy of an investigation. And what I mean by that is that depending on where an accident takes place or where you are in the process, there could be multiple investigators, each with a different agenda. This is a problem. It's a problem in the US in particular, because oftentimes the individual or organization investigating a scuba accident has very, very little information or little experience about scuba diving. They just don't understand it. So they don't know what they don't know, and they can't do an effective job. But generally, an investigation will involve both a public and a private component. The public component is the police, the medical examiner, the Coast Guard, or some other entities working together to help the medical examiner determine the cause of death. And then on the private side, you'll often have the families or an equipment manufacturer or the dive boat operator or an insurance company doing their own parallel investigation. And again, like I said, there's often overlap where there's cooperation, but sometimes there's not. And this is something that's important to know. When the police do an investigation, they're only looking for evidence of a crime. Once they find that no crime was committed, they're done. They lose interest. They don't care to move forward. So unless there's something obvious like a homicide, then rarely will the police go much further in an investigation. They will turn things over to the medical examiner, who's going to determine the cause of death, and then they're done. Same thing with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has a mission to promote safety of the marine environment, especially from a vessel, but the Coast Guard truly doesn't know very much about scuba accident investigations, and they uniformly do a very poor job. They're very reluctant to accept help. They often don't know what they don't know, and they've done a haphazard job. There was some effort about 10 years ago for the Coast Guard to try to improve things, but it in my view, it petered out. I don't see it. I just see stonewalling. And the same really with the National Park Service and with other entities in the federal government. I've told people that, I'd walk down the street naked if the organizers, the entity did a thorough job, and I haven't had to do that. Nobody needs to see that, but I would do it if somebody did a great job in an investigation. Oftentimes, an insurance company or personal attorney will come in and conduct an investigation really to determine if someone is at fault and whether litigation is likely. When I do an investigation, I don't care if litigation is likely. It doesn't matter to me one way or another. I just want to know what happened so I can advise my clients about what corrections they need to make or not make, or something they need to be aware of or warn against. And that information is the primary cause. If there's a lawsuit, great. I've had, dozens of SCUBA accident lawsuits. I've never lost one, primarily because I do an early investigation and I know the facts pretty well. And that's about it. But you have to know the objective of the individual investigator before you engage, or as you're following along. If you want to know why your loved one died underwater, know that the police are not going to really go much further if a crime wasn't committed. The medical examiner probably doesn't understand scuba diving and may not use the appropriate protocols, and an attorney or an insurance agent is trying to determine who is at fault, and it might be your husband or your father or your brother, and you take that information and do with it what you will. Medical examiner versus the coroner. In the UK and Canada and other places we have coroners. Whether an investigation is, in the United States we have medical examiners, in some places we have both. The primary difference is that a medical examiner is a licensed physician. So they understand the human body, they understand physiology, they understand sometimes the effects of pressure on the body, and they can tell what they're seeing and what that could mean. It's not always. A coroner is often an elected official who oftentimes doesn't even have to have college education, and they do not have to be a licensed physician. So you can already see that in the United States, if you're dealing with a coroner, you might be getting the same person that is the registrar of wills, or is the person that counts the votes at the school board election, or is maybe a deputy sheriff or even the county sheriff, but they don't have any medical training unless they've gone out and taken it. And that's a problem. So it is when you talk about the efficacy of an investigation and how things will move forward. In the UK, Australia, Canada, a coroner acts like a judge. They've got the authority to hear evidence and call witnesses, and they make a determination of what the end result is. Medical examiner and coroners have somewhat the same duties. In most jurisdictions, they're charged with determining the manner of death, which is legally classified into one of 5 categories: accidental, natural, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. The manner of death is important to, and it goes along with the cause of death. And you will often see drowning as a result of scuba diving, or in the UK, you could call it misadventure, which is something happened and an accident occurred and somebody died. But because of the incorrect procedures, and undetermined is obvious. So once the manner of death is determined to fall into one of these 5 categories, the investigation is not obligated to go any further. They've done their jobs. So oftentimes in a scuba fatality, the medical examiner will determine that the diver drowned and it was accidental because they didn't commit suicide, and it wasn't a homicide, and they can tell that they drowned because they have water in their lungs, and they'll leave it at that. And that is a very unsatisfying conclusion. If the medical examiner or coroner is doing their job properly, there's a matrix of items that need to be investigated to determine why somebody died. There are human factors, and they start with the pre-accident. They include the medical history of the diver, whether the diver was using drugs, prescription medication, or over-the-counter medications, what their training and certifications were, their most recent diving experience, and the date of their last dive. This information tells you a whole lot. At the time of the accident, the human factors analysis says, were there any complaints? Were they saying they were cold? Could they not get air out of their regulator? Was the regulator free flowing? Was their wetsuit or dry suit too tight? Look at these complaints, because oftentimes they lead to panic. Oftentimes they'll give you an indication. I have chest pain before I get in the water, and I also have a heart condition. Well, maybe I had a cardiac arrest, and you can follow the causal chain. Post-accident, the human factors involve the autopsy findings and the toxicology findings. Did the diver have a tear in his or her lungs? Did the diver have air in the circulatory system? That's an arterial gas embolism. Did the diver have any bruising? Did the diver have any bite marks? Did the diver have blocked arteries? Did the diver have water in their belly? All of these things will show you something. And then the toxicology findings are interesting because oftentimes they don't show much of anything other than caffeine or maybe a Sudafed or some sort of over-the-counter medication. But sometimes you find that divers are diving after taking Ambien or narcotics or painkillers, and they do all kinds of things they're not supposed to do, and the toxicology report will show that. The next thing in the accident investigation matrix is the environment. What was the purpose of the dive? What was the plan for the dive? What was the time of entry? What were the conditions like? Surface conditions, wave height, wind, current. What was the underwater visibility? Was there dangerous marine life present? Was there structures or hazards or snags, or was it a wreck dive or underneath a pier? What was the water temperature at the top or at the bottom? What was the location of thermoclines? When divers get cold, they tend to be uncomfortable, and they lose sight of their objectives, and oftentimes they'll panic or they can't do certain things. What was the time of the incident? How long was the diver in the water? How long was the diver under the water? And how long were emergency personnel notified? I had a case once where the diver left the group of students after 3 minutes and went off on his own, and they sat around for about 30 minutes waiting for him to come back. He didn't. So they went onto the beach and they did things, and 3 hours later, they reported him missing. And he was found less than 20, 30 feet away from where they had been, and he had been dead for quite a long time. Last but not least, last and probably least, are witness observations. Witness observations are notoriously unreliable because people forget. Not everybody sees everything. Not everybody knows what they're looking at, and they're good to collect, but I discount them heavily. They're not as important as other types of information that you can glean primarily from the equipment, which is the next phase. Apologize for the beeping. 6 o'clock at night here. Why would they go home? The equipment, you have to look at the type of equipment. Open circuit versus closed circuit rebreathers. Was it rental equipment? Was it privately owned? What was the amount of weight? Was they wearing a wetsuit or a dry suit? Was all of it recovered or just partially recovered? Was it photographed and inventoried? Only about half the time is it actually photographed and inventoried. Inventoried half, photographed about a third. That's frustrating. Who examined it? Was it based on I got a guy network? I got a guy down the road who has a dive shop and he knows things about regulators because I saw one hanging there, or is it somebody really competent? Was the dive computer data downloaded and examined? This is probably the single most important piece of evidence that can be collected during a diving accident. And it would probably tell you why I'm going to throw a rock at the operator of that equipment. Now, the diving computer data doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. It doesn't owe allegiances to the family or to an instructor or to a dive boat. It's not a lawyer. It will tell you oftentimes exactly what happened to the person and exactly what the causal chain shows. You can look at it and see when things started to go awry and why, oftentimes, and it'll tell you everything you need to know. Sadly, the dive computer data is often not downloaded or examined, and I just don't understand that. I don't know why. It's stupid, but they don't do it. So you get the information much, 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 much later. Maybe there's a lawsuit. Maybe there's some type of information where the dive computer data comes forward and it tells you exactly what happened and why. And there you've solved your mystery. So when I do see dive computer data, I measure it against what the witnesses say. Is it consistent or inconsistent with what the witness statements say? Pretty much it's inconsistent, but it's the more reliable piece of evidence. And then you know perhaps why the witnesses are either have incomplete knowledge or they're biased or they're not as reliable in some way. Next, there's an equipment examination, and you note issues with the equipment. Was it broken? Was it cracked? Was there a free flow in the gases? How much gas was left? Was it contaminated? All these things have to be looked at in an equipment investigation, and hopefully that equipment investigation is videotaped so that somebody competent can come back and look at it later and see what was or was not done properly. Whenever I do equipment investigations, I do it with somebody knowledgeable. We don't touch the equipment. We direct the authorities on what to do. We videotape the equipment inspections, and we always invite the family of the deceased to come and sit in and ask questions. Anything is above board, and everything is above board, and nothing is off limits. So some don't do it that way. I think it's the best way, and I think it leads to everybody being on the same page. One of the major problems with scuba accident investigations is that the decline in scuba diving has had an adverse impact on the quality of investigations. Scuba diving has been in decline in the United States for most of the last 15 years, if not all the last 15 years, and it's been in precipitous decline for the last 5. Currently, less than 1% of the U.S. population engages in scuba diving. And to give you a comparison, more people in the United States practice Tai Chi than are scuba divers. There are more cheerleaders than there are scuba divers. There are 5 times as many bird watchers and cyclists, and now more than almost double the number of people are stand-up paddleboard aficionados. So when you really think about it, I don't know how many people in my neighborhood practice Tai Chi, and unless the medical examiner is a scuba diver themselves, you're highly unlikely to get some important information, and they just don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what they're looking at. They don't care, honestly, and many of them don't care. Very few non-scuba diving medical examiners that I've encountered in the last 25 or 30 years have gone and taken the extra step to understand and learn what it could have been that caused this person to die. And it's a rare thing when you find them, and it's great to interact with a medical examiner or coroner that has that level of knowledge or curiosity to learn a new knowledge that they don't already have. But in my experience, I can blame that directly on the lack of familiarity with scuba diving and the lack of people who are getting into diving and staying in diving and are diving with their families and their children and staying in the United States. So yeah, get used to it. The quality of an investigation suffers due to unfamiliarity and a lack of consistency in the materials reviewed because people don't know what to look at. And if they accept help, we'll show them what to look at. If they don't accept help, we'll embarrass them later on for not looking at it. It's a lesson the Coast Guard continues to learn. So location matters. Ironically, the lack of scuba diving participation doesn't seem to matter in Commonwealth countries like Australia or Canada or the United Kingdom because they have different procedures for doing investigations, and they're far more stringent. They're far more likely to accept outside help and seek advice from experts and really probe in a coroner's inquest what it was that caused a person to die. That does not occur in the United States, and the lack of knowledge about the sport actually does matter. So if you're interested in where some of the best locations are to die while you're underwater, the mountain states of the United States are not it. Do not go scuba diving in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, or Nevada and expect your loved ones to know why you died underwater. It's just going to be a drowning. And if you are really inclined to help your family understand what happened to you, I suggest that you go scuba diving in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is where Phoenix is, because they do the best investigations I've ever seen in 30 years of doing this type of law. Astonishing. Next would be Los Angeles County, Orange County, or San Diego County, in that order. And after that, you're kind of on your own. In general, I would try not to die in an area that falls under the jurisdiction of the United States Coast Guard and the United States Park Service, because your family's going to be at a loss and unsatisfied, and they'll get the runaround. Sorry. So if you're involved in a serious accident or some sort of injury, and you're dealing with the police or the Coast Guard or the investigators, you have to assume that they have very little knowledge of what's happening. If you want to help the investigation without interfering, you could try to explain to the investigator what certain things mean, or what certain pieces of equipment record, what a dive computer is, how not to destroy the data on it by not touching it and interrogating it, but leaving it for somebody who knows what they're doing. You can try to be as precise as possible in giving your witness statements, and you can provide information about the diver's training, recent experience, what they were saying at the time of the incident, how they felt. All that information is very, very helpful in an investigation. And after that, you just hope for the best. So here are some examples of information not collected or examined during dive accident investigations that were pretty critical. Here's the dive computer data from a diver named Bobby Barrett. Bobby Barrett was the first closed-circuit rebreather lawsuit in the United States, first wrongful death case. And what was not collected was his dive computer data. It was actually destroyed by an expert for the family later on when they removed the battery from the dive computer. But fortunately, somebody took a photograph of the dive profile, and this was the only piece of evidence that we had to go on. And it shows that Mr. Barrett entered the water. He went down to 42 feet. He made an ascent to about 37 feet, back down, went up to about 15 feet, came back down, and then flatlined. So he was obviously unconscious very, very, very early into the dive. This was a 3-hour dive where his buddies went up on shore and made lunch and sat around before they finally notified the authorities. And Mr. Barrett's death resulted in 4 years of litigation to determine what happened to him. Ultimately, nobody knows. They just know that it wasn't the rebreather, and a jury found so unanimously. Another very well-known case that's ongoing, it's almost now in its 5th year. This is the Rob Stewart case. Rob Stewart was a filmmaker who was diving on a closed-circuit rebreather, diving to 225 feet to film sawtooth sharks off the Florida Keys. And there's a lot of stories and a lot of conjecture about what caused Mr. Barrett to die. For reasons I don't understand and will never understand, the medical examiner never collected the dive computer data from Mr. Stewart's rebreathers, and he never looked at it. And he came up with a conclusion that Mr. Stewart lost consciousness due to hypoxia. But if you look at the actual dive computer data from that final dive, you'll see a couple of things. Number one, the partial pressure of oxygen was at 1.0, almost 100% on the surface. If Mr. Barrett or Stewart was breathing that, he couldn't be hypoxic. And if he took the mouthpiece out of his mouth on the surface like we know he did, he was breathing air. So you can rule out hypoxia as a disabling injury or disabling event. It's the one thing you actually can rule out. You'll also notice a very, very rapid ascent from 225 feet to about 20 feet. Mr. Stewart ascended at about 75 feet per minute. And you'll notice that he violated his decompression stops on this dive. You'll also note that he was very close to a central nervous system toxicity, 78% to 86%, and he was over 90% on the prior dive, and he only had a 20-minute surface interval. Other things you notice from the dive computer data are that He told the computer he was breathing a mixture of 10% oxygen, 20% helium. He actually wasn't. He was breathing 1050. So he omitted an hour and a half to 2 hours of decompression. And then he made a rapid ascent on the third dive, and he lost consciousness and sank. And so here's another piece of information that's not often considered when we talk about what caused Mr. Stewart to die. He sank with the mouthpiece out of his mouth and his power inflator hose disconnected on his BCD. So what you'll notice are under his hands are 2 sling bottles that he had carried for the first time, making him negatively buoyant, probably by an extra 5 to 10 pounds. He was kicking on the surface, and his BCD was disconnected. So he had no ability to inflate his BCD, and something happened to him, and he sank. And ironically, this is something that was not considered by the medical examiner. Here is the first photograph taken of Mr. Stewart in the medical examiner's office after he's been recovered, and they failed to notice, even though they had photographs, that his BCD was disconnected. It's just one of those things. Conclusion. Research shows that drowning is listed as the cause of death in 70% of scuba diving fatalities. However, drowning often means that simply the diver died while they were underwater. There's no standard diagnostic criteria for drowning, and it's a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning no effort is made to determine to exclude other causes of death or to determine why a diver drowned. As Dr. Jim Caruso has stated, drowning is a very unrewarding finding if you just stop there. So the purpose of these investigations is really, we know in the majority of cases, to find out why somebody drowned. Unfortunately, most diving fatality investigations in the United States do stop at drowning, and the situation is getting worse, not better, with the decline in familiarity of scuba diving. So anyway, it's important for divers who care about safety and decision makers tasked with ensuring safety in diving to know the procedures for proper scuba fatality investigations, know how to do them properly, know why it's important to do them properly, understand the current limitations. And then when you look at information gleaned from scuba accident investigations, you can then ensure either proper training, proper equipment configuration, or proper planning for your own dives so that you come back to your loved ones at the end of the day. So that I will take questions. Thank you.
Gareth, you were on mute one more time.
Okay, David is now backstage, and I've just invited him up onto the stage area, and he's here. So if anybody has any questions for David, can you please go into the I have a question table, and we will bring you up onto stage, and I'll bring David. Oh, there we go. David is now visible. Thanks so much for joining us, David.
Sure, thanks again.
And Dave Conlon, I will invite up. Oh, sorry, we've already got somebody else as well. So here we go. Dave. It should be here in a sec.
There he is.
Dave, over to you,
Dave.
Alta.
Hey, David, thanks very much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. It was, I'm sorry you couldn't be there to give it yourself. One of the things I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm asking for input and feedback. You singled out the National Park Service as one of the worst places to drown, and for that, I'm sorry. We tried to provide beautiful scenic expanses for Americans and visitors to kill themselves in, but at the same time, we would like to be responsive to the needs of the family. What can the Park Service do better that we're not doing now to make our investigations better and to bring better closure to the families of people who die?
I really appreciate that, Dave. First, two specific examples. If you discover that the subject of an investigation has taken evidence from a body, you should arrest that person and impound the evidence, not let them keep it. It's a criminal investigation, as you know. Second, your investigators absolutely should not advise witnesses and subjects of an investigation not to speak to attorneys or investigators for families and training agencies. That I understand that investigators have to build a rapport with a witness, but they shouldn't give them advice not to speak to others that have a legitimate need to know information.
Okay, and is this the result of an experience with more than one investigation, or just is this a specific example is drawn from a particular investigation?
It's specific to one, but it's also it's happened in two.
Okay.
In the last year and a half.
Okay.
And so that's troubling. Frankly.
Yes, and clearly we need to do better. And I think that the other thing that I would say is that that's inexcusable. I hope that you'll be able to make some time and see my presentation tomorrow, because I myself was the subject of a National Park Service diving investigation, which I think I think we have a lot of common ground here. The other thing, though, is you've been a great advocate for victims of drowning and death involved in SCUBA, and I would just encourage you to continue that advocacy by reaching out sort of outside normal channels back to the National Park Service or the Coast Guard or anyone else and say, look, this investigation was a complete crap show, and this is how it needs to get done better. Because you don't have to continue just to speak in a certain line. We do care, and we do need to do better, and I appreciate you calling us out for it. So thank you.
Dave, I appreciate it. Look, I have said, I've been doing conferences like this and pro bono for well over a decade, whether it was the Dan Fatality Workshop or Rebreather Forum 3 or Gareth's invitation to do this, and I will always continue to do so. And I will always continue to tell people to put me out of a job. I don't need to do dead diver cases to make my life complete. I don't need to see another file. I don't need to see more autopsy photos. So, but it's important. I think I recorded my talk the other day, but one thing that anybody listening should know if they're in a position of authority is the attorneys are not your enemy. The attorneys have clients that have a legal right to know, an obligation to know, so that they can promote safety. I know that when I represent equipment manufacturers, they have a legal duty to investigate these accidents so that they can inform the Consumer Product Safety Commission within 24 hours if something is with their product is causing injuries or harm, and they have a duty to find that out and fix it. So when we do these investigations, it's because we're legally required to do so. It's not about the money. It's not about, there's insurance to cover accidents. It's about finding something that you need to know so you can make others safe. And that's a really serious responsibility. And that's the only reason I'm involved. So that applies to local sheriffs. It applies to coroners. It applies to the Coast Guard, the Park Service, Maricopa County. There are always resources that my clients can bring to bear that you don't readily have access to. Also experience. I've done 22 fatality investigations since last March. Just since last March. So oftentimes the people I talk to haven't done 2 in their entire careers. So it's a really serious thing. And the Patty's lawyers have the same right to know something that I do, my clients do. And the ultimate goal is to make this sport safer. It is to identify reasons why accidents happen so that we can make it safer. We can train, we can fix product designs, we can provide better warnings, we can go to checklists, for example. The switch to using checklists came as a result of a concerted effort by everybody involved to make sure that happened. And if I'm out of a job, I don't care. I'll just go and do dog bite and divorce cases. I don't care. I'd rather not. And it's super important. So thank you for the.
Well, and I would just say too that, if the investigators involved in a dive accident are impeding or inhibiting or corrupting the flow of information to the places that it needs to go, then the agencies that those investigators work for need to know about that.
Yeah.
that needs to be corrected at a sort of systemic level. And it can't be written off as, oh, well, that's just how agency X does it, because that's not acceptable at all.
I totally agree. And I will address, there's one incident in particular, one file in particular that's going to be addressed. Frankly, we're going to start with Congress and work our way down because there have already been inquiries at that level. And the same thing, frankly, needs to happen with the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard uniformly is bad. And I look forward to the day when I talk to a Coast Guard investigator that cares and wants help or is willing to just listen. Because I had a conversation with a Coast Guard commander once, and I said, here's the answer to the question you will never ask me. Brian. And they said, who's Brian? And I said, Brian is the person whose life you could have saved if you had only done your job. Because that's the name of the person that Gareth and I looked at when we spoke at a conference, and we weren't allowed to talk about what was learned in an investigation. And Brian died 2 weeks later doing exactly what I wasn't allowed to tell him not to do. And I don't like that. I can still picture him. So we have a duty. I have a professional duty. Investigators have a professional duty to help keep people safe. And I think
that I'd grab somebody else from the stage a sec, Dave. As in, sort of Dave Conlon, is it a quick one? Otherwise, we've got somebody else in the question table.
No, I would just add that we in the agencies and in government, we have a duty to continuously improve and to never settle for what we're doing now as good enough. So
right, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. And I'll bring Seb up.
We'll talk offline if you want. Happy to. Next.
So Seb, over to you.
Sorry, that was quite overwhelming moment, David, about Brian. It's just knocked me slightly off my filter. Thank you for the presentation. My question is far less profound. I was just curious about a sequencing thing, because you had pointed out that once the police have established, in their opinion, that a crime hasn't been committed, that's the end of their involvement. And am I to assume that you and your team may have then been brought in at that point because that wasn't a satisfactory answer for a relative of the victim, for example?
No, my team and I do have an investigator that works for me full-time on these cases. I often find out about a serious accident or a fatality within hours. Like, I hate every Monday in the summer because I find out who died on Saturday and Sunday. And it's so we're brought in immediately, and immediately is within hours or days, rarely more than a week, probably more. Normally it's within 2 or 3 days, because evidence goes stale. Oftentimes, the investigators at the scene don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what's important. They don't know that a dive computer is the single most important piece of evidence that needs to be collected. Go home and car with a dive buddy. And we try to help them preserve the evidence, and then looking at it in a way that they understand it. It happens shortly thereafter.
The question that I was kind of getting to is that if at the time a crime is not deemed to have occurred, can that decision be changed later? I guess, can a crime then be reported later, subject to, for example, your investigation or someone else's investigation, or is that no crime is being committed, that's the determination and that's the end for someone who might be looking for a more thorough answer?
Yes, a criminal case can be reopened if there's a determination not to prosecute, which is 99.99999% of the time. A determination can be made to reopen the case based on the finding of new evidence. I will say, in my experience, that almost never happens, because there's the suspicion that a civil lawyer or lawyer for the family or somebody is trying to do something other than help the prosecution, help the law enforcement. They think I've been told this numerous times. If we prosecute this person, that's going to help your case. And I've said to them each time, no, it won't, because if you prosecute somebody and they get convicted for harming, committing a crime, if there's others that are responsible, they're going to all point the finger at the criminal, and they could walk and get away without being held responsible. So the criminal side of this, I've been involved in multiple criminal investigations involving scuba diving, and I have never seen a prosecution, unfortunately, in certain instances. And I do defense work, so it's an interesting thing. There's a reluctance.
Brilliant. Thank you for your time, David. I appreciate it.
That's a long answer.
David said, thank you very much for closing that. David, thank you for coming in and getting things sorted. For everybody else, that's it. That's a wrap for today. All of the presentations that have been made are being uploaded right now, and they'll be available within 90 minutes of the conference finishing, in sort of 5 minutes or so. So you can log in with the accounts you've got and catch up with the ones that you didn't see because you're in the halls. And then we start tomorrow at 0900 UTC, which is 10 o'clock UK, with Simon Mitchell talking about bringing human factors into healthcare, and Laura Walton looking at panic and how that can be, well, how it develops and what we can do in terms of managing that. So thank you very much. Have a great evening or morning or day, wherever you are, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks very much.